Hello, and welcome to The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification. I'm Todd Trauman, I'm the CEO of Emission Control. If you are a procurement manager, a fleet operator, or one of the millions of people tasked with a zero-emission deployment goal, this podcast is for you. We speak with industry experts, funding experts, OEMs, and many others to help you stay ahead of this enormous electrification shift underway. Welcome back to The Charge Cycle, an electrifying podcast on all things electrification. Elaine O'Byrne, Director of Operations at Fuse, co-hosting with us today. 2 pods in a row, Elaine. Hello. It's going good. I'm really excited to have you here. We're going to be doing a deep dive on some regulatory discussions here. So excited to have you here. Elaine, for those that don't know, is one of the foremost regulatory authorities on the Fuse team and is deeply involved with a lot of the regulatory amendment cycles going on the low carbon fuel standards in which the team at Fuse works. So excited to have you back, Elaine. Thanks for jumping on. Also very excited to have Colin Murphy here today on the Charge Cycle. He is the co-director of the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiative at the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, one of the foremost experts in low carbon fuel policy. Colin, welcome to the Charge Cycle. Happy to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Todd and Elaine. Really happy to be here.
So before we get too deep into some of the kind of low carbon policy work that you work on currently today, I'm excited to just kind of get to know you a little bit. I'd love to hear your education background, kind of how you ended up landing at at UC Davis, and just kind of give us the 101 on Colin.
Sure. So I'm actually a kind of a UC Davis lifer in a lot of ways. This is my third time. I did my bachelor's here. I was originally a biomedical engineer, spent a few years doing surgical laser stuff. That was really interesting. But I got sort of frustrated with patient care because the problem with medicine wasn't that we didn't have good enough technology. It's the economics and regulation were screwed up around it. So I went back to school planning to study medical policy and medical regulation. And in a fairly long story, ended up leaving medicine entirely and switching into transportation and energy, climate change, sort of air quality. So the second time I was at UC Davis for my PhD, where it was at the Institute of Transportation Studies. The degree is technically Transportation Technology and Policy, which is sort of a recognition that all of the interesting questions in transportation right now are interdisciplinary and don't really fall into the nice, easy silo that traditional academia is built around. So ITS and the degrees we offer people have a wide variety of interests and focuses. Mine was mostly on life cycle analysis of advanced biofuel systems. So I was looking at the previous generation of cellulosic ethanol, the hydrolysis and fermentation pathways. That there were some pilots globally. Most of them failed, but a couple of them in Brazil seem to have worked, and maybe that technology is moving forward on sugarcane in Brazil. But we thought we're going to be using corn stover and switchgrass, and Iowa was going to become the Saudi Arabia of ethanol, and all these great ideas that never really came to pass because the technology just never quite got there where it needed to be. So after that, I spent a year in the California legislature as a science policy fellow with the California Council on Science and Technology, where I got to work on some sustainable transportation stuff, ran a bill on the LCFS, which we picked a fight with the oil industry and lost. But it was
what year is this?
This was 2013, 2014 when I was in the legislature. This is when the LCFS was pretty new. Everybody was kind of worried that it was only bringing in corn ethanol and soybean biodiesel and not much else. And that was because the target was 1% at the time. It was meant to ramp up slowly, and you're not going to see changes when the thing's ramping up slowly, but there was a lot of concern, so we were trying to address that. Some of the concepts that we created ended up getting passed through in future bills and grant programs later, but it was a kind of a formative experience on the politics of clean energy and transportation and fuels. And then after the year in the legislature, I spent 4 years doing climate policy advocacy with a group called NextGen. That was sort of Tom Steyer's advocacy organization. I did a lot of work on sustainable transportation in general, as well as climate policy. So got to work on helping secure the passage of things like SB 32 in California, which gave us the authority to have a climate policy more broadly. I was actually in the Senate gallery when that bill, the Assembly gallery when that bill passed.
A landmark day.
Yeah, we actually thought that the bill was dead. Kind of a long political story there. We were there basically like setting up the fight for next year, and then all of a sudden, so it was like, get to the floor, they're voting on it. We've actually got the votes. It was fantastic.
Wow.
But in my last year with NextGen, this was the 2018 LCFS amendment readoption, the last big sort of amendment and readoption package that went through. And we recognized that the LCFS was a really important topic in climate policy in California. It was one of the things that was actually meaningfully reducing the amount of petroleum we consumed, which is a necessary step if you're going to do anything on climate change. So we supported some research to kind of model what the targets should be. We leveraged that research into helping persuade CARB to adopt a higher target. Their first impression was to go for an 18% target in 2030. We got them to go, not we, but I think we were a big part of getting them to go to a 20% target, which, it's 15 to 20 million tons of total greenhouse gas difference between just that couple percent. As it turns out, 20% was way too low, and we did tell them that. We said 23 or 24 should have been the number, and it turned out that would have been too low as well, but at least we were less wrong than the field on that case. But yeah, we got deeply involved in that because it's such a complex policy. There just weren't a lot of people in the NGO space who understood how it worked. And at the time, of those very small handful of people, one of them was on paternity leave, and the other was kind of like engaged in the federal fuel economy fight when Trump was trying to roll back fuel economy standards. So I sort of, even though I was pretty new on the job and not really necessarily felt prepared for it, ended up having to be kind of one of the lead experts in the NGO community working on this bill and sort of helping leverage the research and play a role there. So we were really happy with what we were able to do and got a stronger, more effective LCFS as a result. Always with the understanding that this policy was going to be continuously evolving and it was not going to be the last word. So after that, I came back to UC Davis. I came back to the deputy director role at the Policy Institute. And for most of the 2010s, there had been no real interest or engagement in fuel policy within the academic space. The LCFS existed, and a lot of groups looked at it as being an important policy and really effective and useful, but fuels in general are a tough place to operate because there's not a lot of clear, sort of black and white wins and losses. Whereas with electric vehicles, we know there are very few cases where deploying an electric vehicle is a bad thing for the environment, right? If your grid's like 90% coal, okay, maybe an EV is not a good idea there, but most places an EV is at least awash with petroleum and likely to be better. So they're kind of a no regrets proposition. The same isn't true with fuels. Somebody says, are biofuels good or bad? I don't know. Depends. Which biofuel? What are you making it out of? What's the market like? What's being burned in? So I think, everybody sort of looked at it and said, well, this is complex and messy, and let's focus on deploying EVs. So all of the research and advocacy and, the energy and funding went to deploying EVs, which isn't a terrible choice if you've got really limited funding, but it gave us, it brought us to the position we are now, and that is a lot of jurisdictions have made really ambitious, set really ambitious targets for decarbonizing their transportation system. Sometimes a lot of it was through the Paris Agreement and then the kind of side subnational agreements that came out of that process. They realized, okay, right, we've got to decarbonize transportation to meet our climate goals. EVs are the most important tool we've got, but they can't do everything. They can't deploy fast enough to meet most of the important midterm targets. And in the long run, there's a few sectors of the transportation portfolio where EV is just not a great fit for the duty cycle. So you got to have fuels. If you don't consider the life cycle impact of your alternative fuels, you're missing a big part of their environmental footprint. And that's where a lot of the early fuel policies went wrong, is sort of ignoring those indirect effects. So if you need a life cycle based fuel policy, that's basically the LCFS.
Right.
And so a lot of groups are realizing, oh, wait, this is actually kind of more important. And some attention started to come back to this space, a little more research funding. So when I came back to Davis, after the first year or two, we were able to rebuild a fuel policy team. For most of the 2010s, Julie Whitcover, who co-directs the fuel policy team at Davis with me, she was sort of keeping the flame alive on fuel policy research by herself. And it's fantastic. One person is, even when you're as smart and effective as Julie is, one person cannot do nearly enough. Even the team we have cannot do nearly enough to answer the critical questions in this space. But at least there was something happening. We've been able to rebuild a bit, bring on a few grad students and try to sort of have a team that focuses on modeling how the LCFS is implemented, understanding what trends do we see in the different jurisdictions that have adopted it so far, and can we sort of project those trends onto the jurisdictions that are thinking about adopting it.
Yeah. How big's the team now?
Right now we have about 5 people. We it's Julie and myself and 3 grad students. We had a postdoc who left a couple months ago because he got a real job with Oak Ridge National Lab. Yeah. Apparently, people who go through many years of grad school eventually want to get paid a living wage. Who knew?
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're hoping to bring on another kind of postdoc or professional researcher. We would love to get bigger because there's no shortage of questions in this space. It's just finding the resources to do it.
Yeah, ultimately, I know that we, despite being that size team, that's probably some of the biggest brain power around this type of activity in policy that we're aware of.
I can't think of another university research group that even has 6 people working on something like this. And given how many jurisdictions have LCFS and how many more are thinking about it,
in the near term,
it's not enough. This is one of the big problems in the space. The expert community around fuels is too small. People need to know how this stuff works because there's a lot of misconceptions about how the LCFS works and what it does, and everybody sort of sees in it what they want to, and that has led to some problems when jurisdictions are starting to try to implement this and have an unrealistic expectation of what it takes.
Colin, you were talking obviously about the constraints with smaller teams and just faced with the amount of questions and work that's going on. One thing that, we internally like to try to leverage as much as possible, and is obviously a very trendy topic, is just generally the use of AI. I see you nodding your head, so you could probably guess where I was going with that. But I'd love to hear just how or if, the UC Davis team is thinking about implementing that, or, what is maybe best practice for something so new like that.
So we're not using it much yet. Occasionally we'll use it to automate lit reviews or find answers if we're just like throw a net over the whole internet and give me as many answers on this topic. The issue is a lot of what we do at ITS is supply our judgment and expertise and put it in. It's one thing to make a model. It's another thing to interpret it properly. And to recognize that all models really are wrong. And you have to understand how the particular model you're using is wrong and factor that into how you present any findings from it. And this is where I think a lot of jurisdictions and even, I think a lot of jurisdictions kind of trip up on this is they see a model and they say, well, that model is an attempt to predict the truth. And there's some error bars around it, but it's at least our best guess of what the truth is. And that's not necessarily true. In a lot of ways, when you're doing modeling, the best way to look at it is not like ask the model what's going to happen and take its quantitative response and view that. It's ask what assumptions do I have to bake into the model to achieve that quantitative response. And that's really the kind of learning and the way that it's useful to inform things. AI is just not there yet. AI can look out and say, this model says this is what's going to happen, right? Because it finds a paper, and the paper says we did the model, but AI doesn't have that level of kind of judgment and understanding yet, even apart from the, issue of hallucinations and, the fact that it really doesn't have a good way of telling kind of, propaganda from news, and media and spin. All it can say is there's a website that's got a lot of links that looks official, so I'm gonna trust it. And so, it's useful for some of the basic information gathering and lit review stuff, but beyond that, it's not there yet. I think eventually it might be really useful because I think eventually it might have some better ability to kind of predict market behavior through its sort of inherently big data approach. And we're curious, but it's not ready for prime time, at least not as we've seen.
And it sounds so it sounds like we might be a few years conservatively off from
knock on wood.
a bit out from a GPT coming in to help with these really existential questions for low carbon fuel policy work. But I think one thing that you kind of touched on there is that would become a bit of a circular reasoning kind of loop where you as the expert are feeding the model, which then outputs predictions that are not exactly accurate. Thinking about that, how you kind of like working back from a particular goal, do you think that that's typically the framework or strategy that regulators should be thinking about, just as the baseline for upcoming rulemakings, it's always keeping that long-term goal in mind. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think regulators really do need to keep the long-term goal and really be aware that the idea of climate policy is to make a transformational change in many large facets of modern life, right? We change how we procure energy and how we choose to grow food and how we choose to make the things that we want. And so that transformation is a multi-decade process. Even on the most optimistic and ambitious, even just within transportation, even on the most optimistic and ambitious estimates, California, which is a decade or more ahead of the rest of the U.S. and one of the leading jurisdictions in the world on climate policy, we did a study a few years ago, collaboration with 3 other UCs, about 30 researchers total, on how the California transportation system can get to carbon neutrality by 2045. And even in our most ambitious scenarios for EV deployment, and I emphasize, we've been doing EV research and policy since the 90s. We are big believers in the power of the EV as a transformational technology. We are not underselling our optimistic scenarios, but even under those optimistic scenarios, where even the diehard EV advocates among us are like, okay, guys, maybe tap the brakes a little bit. This is getting a little wacky. You still had 1 billion to 2 billion gallons a year of liquid gasoline demand in 2045, right? The rate of EV deployment is limited by how fast old vehicles retire out of the fleet, essentially. Plus the growth of the fleet, but you've got to get all the old vehicles out to get to that zero emission future. And unless you want to have a ridiculously expensive vehicle buyback program or a ridiculously draconian forced retirement program, you're stuck with that waiting until they retire out. And in that world, there's just no way the math works out to get 100% EVs by 2045. So you're looking, and that's 20 years ahead of time. So you're looking at 20 years to even get down to 10 to 15% of the liquid fuel demand we have today, and another 5 or 10 years beyond that to get that last sort of chunk of it out there. So it's decades.
Yeah.
The assumption, it's going to go through different phases. This is not going to be a straight linear transition from point A to point B. People talk about S-curves in the technology space a lot, where you have, sort of slow deployment at the start, and then you hit a point of critical mass, and then things deploy into kind of the bulk of the market at a very rapid pace, your rapid ascent phase, and then the last, 10, 20, whatever percent is slow again because it is, unusual use cases that it's hard to do, or people have ideological opposition, whatever. The policies that are good for the slow early ascent phase are not necessarily the policies that are good for the middle rapid deployment phase, and those are not necessarily the policies that are good for the end phase.
Yeah.
And you're going to need to update the policy portfolio and update things like the modeling assumptions that you make in a lot of cases. Within the LCFS, it's all based on life cycle analysis. Every fuel gets a life cycle based score for carbon intensity. Most of my PhD was doing life cycle analysis, and so the sort of quote unquote dirty secret of life cycle analysis is there is no way to do a perfectly objective LCA. In every life cycle analysis, there are certain assumptions that are required to be made in order to just finish them doing it and be able to do the math. Things like, where do you draw the system boundary, right? What exactly are you analyzing? Are you considering larger or smaller? If you have a system that is producing 2 things, like when you grow soybeans, you produce soybean meal, which is a high protein animal feed or human feed, as well as soybean oil. Well, we know how many greenhouse, what the emissions are to grow an acre of soybeans. We can sense that and do that pretty well. How much of that emissions goes with the soybean meal and how much of it goes with the soybean oil? There isn't one and only one way to do that. There are multiple methods by which you can make that decision that have been, viewed as being generally, valid, but you can't say there's one and only one way to do it. And so you have to embed that in. And there's stuff like this all through LCA. And so one of the challenges is that as you progress through your transition from the starting point, a world where everything in transportation is petroleum, and nobody's really reducing emissions in a particularly effective way, through a point where you're now only a few people are doing it, to where most people are doing it, to eventually where everyone is doing it, where the entire economy is doing it, the assumptions that are most appropriate for that moment often change. And that's a difficult thing for policymakers, because we work in our policy system is based on precedent, right? The government does something, and that is a durable precedent that they have to follow. sometimes formally in a legal sense, but even if it's not sort of a formal legal precedent, there's just this idea, it's inculcated in the culture that once government does something one way, they shouldn't change it unless they have a really good reason. And so there's this reluctance to change and to break that precedent. And we're seeing that in the LCFS, where there are a lot of assumptions embedded into the way the LCFS calculates carbon intensity that, were appropriate when the program was being first designed, 15 years ago at this point. They're probably just not appropriate now. And it's not because CARB did something wrong, that it was bad or inappropriate, or there was, scientific malfeasance. The world changes. Yeah. These policies are meant to fundamentally change an entire sector in a very profound way. You have to keep updating the assumptions over time, and that is something that policymakers are just typically reluctant to do.
Yeah, I kind of like, just to riff off that a little bit, I think of the kind of current regulatory amendments in the LCFS space now that are inherently seemingly baking in some flexibilities for the unknowns in the future. Something like the auto acceleration mechanism, for example, right? So can you speak a little bit to, how important and maybe some pros and cons of, in baking in these kinds of flexibilities, not the AAM specifically, but like speak to the importance of ensuring that these things can be written in a flexible manner, but not so flexible that they can be, taken advantage of. Maybe if you have some examples or some experience in there, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. So historically, and sort of in theory, you don't really need that flexibility because the CARB board exists and they can always step in and do a rulemaking whenever there's a problem. That's fine in theory. In practice, that doesn't really work because rulemakings are long, they're complex, there's a lot of administrative steps, CARB has to do a lot of analysis, there's legal steps. For example, we've seen this low LCFS credit price issue coming for several years, right? The price started declining in 2021. We knew why it was declining. We knew that the 20% target was not going to be effective. Why are we sitting here in 2024 not having done it? Well, part of it is the CARB has multiple climate policies and a limited number of climate energy systems modelers and the ability to engage with those. So first, they're working on the scoping plan because the scoping plan is the master climate strategy document for California. Okay, it makes sense, right? Do the master strategy and then do the implementation programs that actually carry that out. So fine, you have to do it there. And then, you have to take time to sort of model and deal and sort of understand in a quantitative way what's going on in order to set new quantitative targets. So just the idea that the CARB could step in at any time and make these changes, it just in practice it doesn't work. So building in something like an AAM or more regular internal review periods that don't require a full rulemaking makes sense. There's an idea in public policy that generally, sort of the basically the Chevron doctrine idea, right? That you defer rulemaking to experts in the space over sort of implementation level details where the legislative bodies or the more generalists don't necessarily have the right perspective on it. CARB can't engage quickly enough in most cases. And so something like the AAM allows we see a market failure right now where there's so much renewable diesel coming into the market combined with a couple of other factors, the low existing target, the gasoline demand destruction from COVID that is still maybe not fully rebounded. And if the board can't step in and do a rulemaking to update the program, you got to have some other way to do it. So you build those into the program to try to anticipate problems. And we know that this is important. If you go back to the original documents and the reports that were, issued when CARB was first thinking about the LCFS, when Dan Sperling and the late Alex Farrell were sort of designing it and writing the really formative papers on the topic. If you look at how we thought California was going to comply with it in 2020, we thought cellulosic ethanol was going to be a major source of compliance credit. Well, as it turned out, cellulosic ethanol basically never emerged, right? There's a little bit of what we call corn kernel fiber that is sort of a bolt-on sort of upgrade to corn ethanol plants, but it only adds a few percent of the volume. Other than that, cellulosic ethanol has largely just never materialized. And yet the program's been fine. It has in fact over-complied with its targets to the point where we have too many credits and not enough deficits right now.
By its intent, it's supposed to be a fuel agnostic style of program. Just one quick follow up on the flexibility question. So we've talked about one inherent flexibility on the AAM moving in. If you were a new group like New Mexico's environmental department who's implementing their own program and to your point is it's got a heavy lift in a short amount of time. What other flexibilities come to mind to you that may or may not exist in something like the California LCFS that you would like to see implemented in other jurisdictions?
I think you have to have a regular review of the modeling methodology and those assumptions I talked about to understand when something needs to be changed. In particular, indirect land use change is one of the major areas of complexity and uncertainty in the LCFS. And so, for those of you who haven't gotten embroiled in the ILUC wars, ILUC is indirect land use change. Basically, it's if you build a new biofuel facility that's going to use some sort of let's say a vegetable oil or a waste oil, right?
Inside or outside of California?
Inside or outside of California, it doesn't really matter. But like you're building a new biofuel facility that's using a fat oil or grease of some type to make, let's say, renewable diesel or SAF, jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuel. Prior to that facility being built, all those fats, oils, and greases were being used for something, right? If it's soybean oil or canola oil, those were obviously going into the vegetable oil market and people were eating them. Even things like used cooking oil and tallow, which is a byproduct of meat processing, historically, most of those things would have gone into stuff like animal feed or soaps or candles. Some of these are somewhat lower value products. Some of these, you're mostly using the product as a way to dispose of the used cooking oil or tallow that wouldn't have another use. But there is at the end of the day a demand for animal feed and to have oils in animal feed. There is a demand for soaps and candles. So all those producers of other things, when you take away the feedstock they were using, they have to go out and buy more oil. And if you're just a random producer who needs some sort of lipid and you don't have a waste stream available, you're going to go buy vegetable oil because that's the cheapest way to do it. If you're in the eastern hemisphere of the planet, your palm oil is probably the cheapest vegetable oil available on the market. If you're in the western hemisphere, it's probably soybean oil. So we built this facility, even if it's just consuming things like waste or tallow, but definitely consuming vegetable oil. Whoever was using that vegetable oil in the past, they have to go out and find a new supply. So there's now increased demand. The global market for producing vegetable oils will satisfy that, right? There's tons of people growing vegetable oil who would love to grow more of it to make more money off of it. Some of that increased supply is going to come by clearing more land to bring more land into cultivation. And that is the indirect land use change. When you clear natural land and turn it from natural land into cultivated land, you lose a ton of carbon. All of the plants that were growing on it above ground, those are either burned or just kind of piled up and put off to the side to decompose. So all that carbon goes back in the atmosphere. There's also a lot of solid carbon in the soil. And one of the things you do when you're bringing land to cultivation is you plow it, right? You sort of turn the soil up to break it up, to mix it so things can grow. Well, when you do that, you add a bunch of air into the soil and all the microbes start breaking down the soil carbon and releasing that as CO2. So when you accurately account for the carbon debt from clearing new land, a lot of these biofuels look worse for greenhouse gases than they otherwise would. Now, how much worse? It is incredibly complex. We don't have very good models to analyze that. There was a very famous paper that came out 2 or 3 years ago by Lark et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that said the U.S. corn ethanol program, because of ILUC, the corn ethanol we were producing was worse than petroleum on life cycle greenhouse gases. Now, I have some methodological disagreements with what they did. I think they made a lot of these assumptions in a way that sort of biased them towards overestimating. I don't think it's terribly likely that existing corn ethanol is a lot worse than petroleum. I don't think it's a lot better either. I think it is, a little cleaner than petroleum, as long as we don't want to keep growing it too much and expanding cultivation even more. But
is that part of the debate right now in the LCFS? Is that one of the sticking points? Is that the fact that people are doing it strictly for benefiting financially to bring it to a California, say, or a compliance market, and then land use changes happening? Is that that's on ethanol, that's on the corn-based side, that's very ethanol driven, but it seems like there are similar discussions on dairy gas and
yeah
is that all true?
Yeah, the corn ethanol sort of sector is not growing very much at all. It has sort of stabilized into the volume that the RFS kind of called for. It is what it is. Even if you believe Lark and maybe that we should never have done that corn ethanol thing, it has integrated itself into the energy and the animal feed and the agricultural sector. It's probably not terribly beneficial to try to break it all down, let petroleum start resatisfying that demand, So as long as we don't grow corn ethanol, that's not where the worry is. The worry is on the lipid side, the fats, oils, and greases, because that's where the growth has been. Since, in 2020, we had a little over 1 billion gallons a year of lipid-based fuel production. It was mostly biodiesel with some renewable diesel starting to enter. Now we're around 5 billion gallons. So there's been this really rapid growth in the US, and there's growth in other parts of the world as well, in things that use fats, oils, and greases. And so, again, when you're using a waste, that waste is usually certainly lower ILUC and lower environmental impact. To the extent that we can use cooking oil to make either diesel or jet fuel, we probably should. That is, generally speaking, a good use of it. There's just not enough of the waste and residues to make more than a drop in the bucket of global diesel or jet fuel demand.
I've heard is it true that we're importing enough used cooking oils and such? And so I heard that there were no tariffs placed on that had an impact on the LCFS credit prices and some other things. Does land use change analysis, LCA analysis on land use, does it go beyond our borders?
That's one of the things that CARB talked about actually in the April workshop, where so first of all, yes, we are importing a lot of tallow and used cooking oil from Australia and Asia, China included. It's it's an open question about sort of how good that is for the environment. On one hand, so I don't know what the disposition of tallow and used cooking oil in most of these Asian countries are. Right. My understanding is it's like it is everywhere else in the world, where most of it was used for stuff like animal feed or soaps or candles or other kind of low value products, and we can probably reduce that use without any real environmental or economic harm a bit, but some of it is going to stay there, and some of it's going to find an alternative. But yes, the ILUC impacts absolutely apply. The issue is that the models we have, we don't even have good models for really assessing ILUC on what happens for U.S. crops, much less models that really assess what happens outside of the U.S. So CARB's current approach, and what they said the April 10th is, okay, well, we're going to use this ILUC analysis that we did in 2016. That's what their current approach right now is they sponsored some research, brought in an expert work group, and adopted these ILUC adjustment values in 2016. They said, well, we're going to keep using those for everything where the feedstock's grown in the U.S. And then any place where they're using an agricultural kind of crop feedstock from outside the U.S., we will come up with some alternative on an ad hoc basis, which is kind of what they have to do right now. And, there are a couple problems with this. One is ILUC cannot be measured. Right, you could give me the technology they have in Star Trek. I couldn't build you a sensor that tells you what ILUC is from any given thing, because again, I'm taking this million tons of soybean oil grown in the U.S. to make fuels out of it, and because of that, somebody is clearing land in Southeast Asia or in Argentina or Brazil to grow palm, if it's Southeast Asia, or to grow soybeans in Brazil or Argentina, because I have withdrawn this oil from the sort of international vegetable oil or lipid space to use for fuels, and now there's a vacuum that something's going to get put in there. There's literally at a conceptual level no way to directly measure that, because it all flows through the market. You can only assess it by modeling.
MRV, that's the classic stuff that we see in the voluntary carbon markets as well. That's a good way to measure, report, verify stuff that is so subjective often, it seems like.
Exactly.
I do have a question too.
Sure.
So kind of thinking about all, the politics behind these types of conversations, indirect land use change, and I don't want to use the term greenwashing, but the obvious, just like these types of things that are specific to biofuels and renewable diesel. How do you think that conversation is going to change over time, or just fizzle out completely as we do shift away, like in terms of the transportation fuel pool, towards truly renewable sources, such as electricity, or if we did have green hydrogen, readily available? When do these conversations just become kind of a moot point?
Not soon enough to help is the short answer. Even if you believe, as I do, that pretty much most, maybe all applications in the on-road space will eventually shift to battery electric vehicles. Maybe the really large, Class 8 long-haul heavy-duty trucks, they might need a different solution than batteries. I would still bet on batteries even in that space, but we're uncertain.
So are we.
But yeah, they're absolutely right. But yeah, I mean, even if maybe that niche needs something else, the world uses over 100 billion gallons a year of jet fuel. And it's going to be awfully hard to stabilize the climate if we continue burning 100 billion gallons of petroleum jet fuel over the long run. There is no,
Yeah.
real clear plan for how we're going to find 100 billion gallons a year of some sort of liquid fuel. There's no way biofuels can supply all of that. They could potentially supply part of it if if cellulosics ever kind of figure their stuff out and come online. That would be fantastic. If algae ever figures its stuff out and comes online, that would be fantastic. We're thinking e-fuels, right, where you're capturing carbon, using electricity to split it into carbon monoxide, and then combining that with electrolytic hydrogen to make a synthetic hydrocarbon. That at least, in theory can scale once you've got a whole bunch of extra renewable electricity to do it, which is going to be 10, 20 years before we're really there. So, there's going to be a market that's going to be demanding liquid fuels for a long, long, long time. And the hydrotreating lipids, whether it's crop oils or waste oils, can satisfy that market. So there's always going to be this pressure to bring it in as a source of sustainable aviation fuel.
Right.
As long as that's the case, somebody's going to say, well, we can do this, right? We can do this non-petroleum thing. The issue is we're reasonably confident that a small amount of these fuels, of these lipid-based fuels, are fine to bring into that. That even if you understand that when you take the waste and residues and make fuel out of them, some amount of crop-based fuels enter the market to backfill that loss, even when you account for that and have a proper ILUC, we're reasonably confident that you can have globally a few billion gallons, like single-digit, probably low to mid-single-digit billions of gallons of the stuff globally. But obviously, with 100 billion gallon per year jet fuel demand, there is potential demand for a whole lot more than that. And there's a lot of soybean growers and palm oil growers out there who would love to satisfy even more than a few billion, single-digit billion gallons worth of demand, who are going to keep arguing that we should be doing more using their product. And right now, we just don't have the modeling capacity to say with any confidence whether we can get beyond this little bit that we're at right now and grow much more.
I think one thing that comes to mind too, and tying things back, obviously with the charge cycle, we're very focused on our EV related activities. But one kind of thought that comes to mind with that topic of just when the market is inundated with liquid and gaseous fuel derived credits, and we see obviously the depressed credit pricing that ensues from that. Obviously there are certain applications, we obviously see, electric vehicle space as having positive knock-on effects environment, like after the kind of well-to-wheel calculation happens, that, what would your thoughts potentially be on in the future, while the program is fuel agnostic or technology agnostic, should there come a point where maybe credits derived from electricity or other truly again, these fully renewable sources, fuel sources, have some kind of price premium to them? I mean, I think it's indisputable that there are additional benefits at positive externalities.
Yeah. Tech neutrality is an interesting one. It definitely has been kind of baked into the LCFS from the start. The question is, does it need to be baked into the LCFS to have a functional program and to sort of accomplish your goals? When you go back to when we first made the LCFS and did the research, if you think about it, looking at the technologies that could potentially reduce emissions out of transportation, they all sucked in one way or another. Back in 2010. Like biofuels, we were still waiting for cellulosic ethanol and would be waiting and are still waiting today. Electricity, batteries, we thought batteries were going to be heavy and expensive and have lousy durability for a while. Turns out batteries improved much faster than we anticipated, but we thought batteries were not really going to be able to do it. Hydrogen was still, many, many years away. So we didn't really have a clear idea. We had a lot of technologies that at least could make a somewhat persuasive argument that they could supply a lot of this need for reduced emissions, but none of them that had really proven it to the level of certainty that we needed. So at that point, I think having this really focus on tech neutrality makes a ton of sense, because you don't want one person who is really attached to one technology for one way or another, whether it is they have a blatant conflict of interest and like own stock in it, or they just have read the articles and really believed the popular science article they read, on something, and sort of got overly enthusiastic about it. When you have that kind of uncertainty and no clear picture of what you're going to do, tech neutrality makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that it makes as much sense in the same way now. In the areas where we don't know what technology is going to satisfy, how are we going to get this the 100 billion gallons of jet fuel globally,
Right.
or the 4 billion gallons of jet fuel we use in California? Their technology neutrality still makes sense, but for the on-road vehicles, especially for the light-duty vehicles, we know that the battery electrics have the best combination of capability and price and durability and flexibility to go into different segments and reliability and everything. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to still maintain kind of absolute tech neutrality in the light-duty vehicle space. And so, this isn't me saying we should totally abandon it and completely put our thumb on the scale and skew, and just say all LCFS money should only go to EVs. Because clearly there are parts of the portfolio EVs can't satisfy, and we're going to need answers for those. But yeah, I don't know if maintaining kind of a really scrupulous tech neutrality forever always makes sense in the same way that it does in early years when you don't have a clear sense of the technology landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like one of the bigger elephants in the room on the technology side is really just battery technology. It seems like things are advancing very, very quickly. Energy density is increasing rapidly, costs are going down, and whatnot. How at ITS, how much do you take into account the kind of R&D state of affairs of battery technology as it relates to your policy deployment? Very much to your point. I mean, if it does make sense in the time frame that is potentially sooner rather than later, and knowing what you know about the R&D state of affairs for battery tech, is that kind of invading a lot of the discussions internally on the EV side, at least for ITS right now?
For us, it's a little less about R&D because it's hard to read the tea leaves from R&D and figure out what's going to hit the market in 10 years.
Right.
We spend a little more time looking at capacity deployments. So announcements of who's building a battery factory and what technologies are they using, and are there enough projects in sort of the pipeline to supply both the global and the national level needs for lithium-ion batteries, or whatever battery chemistry you're looking at over time to meet the ambitious EV trajectories that we've adopted in various policies. So we're definitely aware of it, and there are some people in ITS and also in some of the engineering departments at Davis who focus on battery chemistries and are really kind of deep and expert in that way. But at ITS, we really try to focus on doing research in a way that is immediately and directly relevant to policymakers, and answers the questions that they're asking right now. And most of them, it's not that they're trying to do a bill to figure out, is it going to be lithium glass or solid state or flow batteries or whatever that fuels, the EVs sold in 2040. They're asking, can we make the trajectory set forth in advanced clean cars too? If we have a lot of other states in the U.S. adopt advanced clean cars too, using Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, will that mean that now we have too much demand and California is going to have to start competing against the other states? Are we going to have to go and, is California's success in deploying a lot of EVs going to mean that some of the other states don't have enough EVs to meet their targets? And those are the questions, and those are less about the advanced technology and more about who's got a project that's going to be putting steel and concrete in the ground in the next, 2 to 3 years to bring more capacity online.
Right.
Speaking of, just one follow-up question to that, speaking about the overall supply of EVs and supply of batteries, I think it's undeniable that China plays a very big role in everything in that market. And just, we see in Europe, there's a lot more adoption, obviously, for Chinese manufactured EVs. Obviously, recent headlines and announcements and tariffs will definitely curb American adoption of those Chinese imports and automakers. Do you have any thoughts on kind of where the U.S. is right now and our ability to meet demand, or what are the models maybe telling us about kind of like advanced clean cars too? Do we have enough in stock, or will we, in your opinion?
Yeah. So, I mean, most of that I probably would defer to my colleagues at the EV Center who get into those issues with a lot more depth than I do. In general, what they've told me in the various conversations we've had and the projects we've worked on is, yes, California can make its advanced clean cars too. And in fact, the trajectory that we're on right now, which is largely fueled by the massive amount of support from the IRA, and to some extent the bipartisan infrastructure law and the CHIPS Act. But yeah, given those things together, that yes, the U.S. we're on a good sort of trajectory that will let us, at least for the next 4, 5, 6 years, kind of through 2030 or so, be on the trajectory we need to be. Now you have to continue that rate of growth and capacity development installation past 2030. And we don't know if that's necessarily going to do. We have enough data on what's been planned that generally speaking we can say we're not likely to fall off that path in the next 5 years, as long as all the projects that are in the pipeline kind of come to fruition. One of the other things I would say is there have been a number of people that have been somewhat critical of California, thinking that we could have had Advanced Clean Cars 2 move faster. That we could potentially, stop registering new internal combustion engines before 2035, or have, more stringent midterm targets. And the modeling that we've done to some extent says that is in fact true, that California could have gone faster. But the issue is that California has special status under the Clean Air Act. And and it allows other states to adopt our policies through Section 177, right? They can choose to either follow California's environmental policies or really air pollution policies, of which clean cars is one of them for long, convoluted legal reasons. They can either, sort of adopt the federal policy on vehicle emissions, or they can adopt California's policy.
This is why sometimes we used to see OEMs make two versions of cars, one for sections, one in 7 states and one not.
Exactly. And the concern is if California pushes itself to the limit of its potential to move, you're moving so fast that other states are not likely to follow. Because remember, California has, a 10-year or more head start on most of the other states in the U.S. when it comes to EV deployment. We had our first zero-emission vehicle policy come out in the 90s. And we've had the zero-emission vehicle mandate, even though it's been weakened and softened and changed and rearranged a bunch of times. But the basic idea that California had this strong policy that said we are moving to EVs or to zero-emission vehicles as fast as we can. OEMs get on the bus because it's where this is going to happen. And we've had policies to deploy chargers and to do public education and outreach and everything. So we're a ways ahead. Most other states could not keep up with California's maximum pace. And so the idea is we wanted to pick the trajectory that found that sweet spot where you're pushing California as fast as it can go, but not so fast that other states that might be on the fence that would like to adopt a ZEV policy but can't absolutely push all their chips into the middle on this stuff, right now. We didn't want to leave them out. And that's why that's sort of why, and a lot of the Gil Tall, who runs the EV Research Center at UC Davis, he was deeply involved in a lot of discussions with CARB and with a lot of the stakeholders and doing a lot of this modeling to understand what the right trajectory is and how do we thread this needle and find the right middle ground. And so he's pretty confident that yes, there are always tweaks and always things we can do better, and like any policy you want to review and course correct as time goes by. But given the uncertainties, given what we knew, that we'd found a pretty good balance between ambition but not getting so far ahead that no other state could follow.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think that's one thing that's very overlooked or maybe even unknown. I think there's a kind of a feeling out there generally that California just kind of does its own thing and you can take it or leave it, not just in the state but in other states that are following California policy, and less of a consideration. I think that California actually is looking a little bit more broadly to other states, other jurisdictions, to see if they can make it. So kind of bringing this full circle here actually to the LCFS in the same sort of way. One thing that we've long advocated for is to say, hey, whatever changes are happening in California are probably going to find themselves in Washington or Oregon or likely now in New Mexico or whatever other states that are moving forward with these kinds of policies. So knowing what we know about the current regulatory proceedings going on currently, the current regulatory amendment, I would love to just get your kind of hot take here on what you think that is, what you think they are doing right now, what they've maybe missed in the current iteration of the rulemaking. Obviously, they have another version coming out, so we'll not know, or maybe you have some inside scoop, but would love just to kind of get your quick take on that. And then right after this, we got something new in the podcast here. Elaine's going to give you a quick lightning round Q&A.
All right. Sounds
right afterwards. But yeah, let's focus on California because I'm curious to kind of get your feedback on the current state of affairs there.
Yeah, sounds like fun. This is a long answer with many rabbit holes to potentially fall down, even with just this rulemaking. So when this rulemaking started, was first, we first started doing the kind of the pre-rulemaking workshops in 2022 even.
Like
when
small
the discussion,
child when this started, yeah.
I know, yeah, it's
A few
the
more
rulemaking
gray hairs since then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, CARB was totally aware that the credit price was collapsing, and that was a problem because a lot of the investments in things like medium and heavy duty EV charging, advanced or cellulosic biofuels, hydrogen, those needed high credit prices to come to market. They couldn't come, with the price where it is in the kind of the $60 to $80 region. And so they said from the start, this rulemaking is going to be very limited in scope because we want to get it done quickly to get it out to stabilize the credit price. We're only talking about adopting new targets, adding this auto acceleration mechanism, and then doing a couple of other small things we sort of had promised to do in one way or another in the past, like change the infrastructure capacity credits and change how we deal with renewable natural gas to sort of try to address, though I don't think it's going to be successful, the controversy around dairy digesters and things like that. It has, even though there's this attempt to limit the scope of the rulemaking to deal with just these issues, to keep it simple, it has not been simple. This is where they tried to keep it simple, and the narrators, it was not simple. It has gotten very complex and controversial and fraught, particularly because we are seeing the emergence of a new dynamic in the LCFS market. So through 2010 through 2020 or so, a big part of the reason why the credit price has collapsed over the last couple of years is because there's so much cheap renewable diesel out there. And when somebody needs credits to meet their compliance obligation, they can just go and, sign a contract to bring more RD in the state, distribute it, get those credits. And the renewable diesel, like I said, there's, several billions of gallons. I think 3.5 or so of the U.S. capacity. I need to go back and check that number. Is renewable diesel, a bunch more biodiesel out there, which is kind of similar. So there's all these sort of cheap diesel substitutes you can bring in to get credits. And the LCFS is designed to let obligated parties find the cheapest compliance option. That's how it keeps the ultimate impact to consumer prices low. So when you give the space the ability to find a cheap option, it's going to use the cheap option. Right? They're not going to buy, they're not going to go and sign contracts to bring in medium heavy duty vehicle charging, and pay the $120, $150 of credit needed to make that stuff pencil out when they could pay 60 or 80 a credit to get renewable diesel. Like that is the market functioning as intended. So the LCFS has had cheap fuels in the market before that have not destabilized things. But that's been stuff like, corn ethanol or biodiesel. Biodiesel's been around forever. Even renewable natural gas, with dairy gas with the sort of very high credit, it ends up being after the incentive, sort of a relatively cheap compliance option. But for all these other fuels, there's always been some sort of limitation on how much they could grow, right? Corn ethanol, you can't grow past the blend wall. Biodiesel has got blending limits because it doesn't work in cold weather, and so usually it's just blended in like a 5% level. So it had its own blend wall. Renewable natural gas, you have to have an RNG vehicle to do it. There just weren't that many RNG vehicles yet. So all the kind of cheap compliance options had these natural limits on them. Well, the issue is renewable diesel doesn't have this natural limit, right? You can blend it in at 100% into diesel. And there was prior to the LCFS, a 4 billion gallon a year, roughly, diesel market in California. Now, about 60% of all the diesel in California is biodiesel or renewable diesel. So, 2.5 billion gallons or so is no longer petroleum. But that still means you've got about 1.5 billion gallons of petroleum diesel left in the California. So there's a lot of market left to go over. So if you have 5 billion or more gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel capacity at the national level, it can easily come to California. It has shown over the last couple of years that it's happy to come into the California market for credits in the $60 to $80 range. Why would anybody who has a compliance obligation pay for the more expensive thing? Right? They can, for the next 2, 3, 4 years probably, they can just keep meeting the additional credit obligation through these things, and they are incentivized to find the lowest cost way to do it. And so this ends up being a problem because, okay, fine, so we meet our targets. We can even raise the targets and still meet them. We can easily do a 30% target by 2030 if we let all the renewable diesel in the world come in. But renewable diesel kind of has a ceiling for how low carbon it can go. Like crop-based fuels, they can get you maybe 30% lower than petroleum, maybe 40, kind of at most. Maybe you can add CCS into get a little bit lower than that. But, crop-based fuels, they can't get to zero. There's no real pathway, at least not for a vegetable oil crop, not that we know right now. Waste and residues, they can get 70 or 80%, but there's a limited amount of waste and residues out there, so they can't really grow. So they just don't have a pathway to get you close enough to zero to really be helpful in 2050, or at the scale you need to decarbonize. So it's kind of a very stereotypical bridge fuel, right? It has some value to reduce emissions right now, particularly emissions from the existing vehicle fleet, and we should use it up to the right point, but you don't want to just invest in bridge fuels because eventually the bridge fuels run out and you've got to go and find something else. Mm-hmm. And for things like cellulosics and medium heavy duty EV, especially the charging infrastructure, if we spend the next 2 or 3 years not investing in those things, then that's 2 or 3 years that those markets don't develop. The technologies don't develop, the infrastructure isn't built, the workforce isn't trained, all these things that have to happen to make medium heavy duty EVs, cellulosics, hydrogen, viable cost competitive options in the 2030s and 2040s, you have to have investment flowing into that space right now. And with the market dynamic where it is, that's not going to happen. CARB's approach is to use the one tool they've always used in the past, which is let's throw more target at it, right? If we just raise the target enough, eventually we'll get through that. And that is true. Eventually, you raise the target enough. First of all, crop-based fuels stop generating credits. They still have a cost advantage compared to petroleum. In fact, they still have the same cost advantage to petroleum they have now, but at least they're not getting a check from, the state paid for by gasoline consumers. So maybe they naturally fall out, but that doesn't happen for 5 or 10 years, even with increased target. And as you increase the target, the cost to gasoline consumers goes up. The vast majority of the money, almost all the money in the LCFS that goes to all these fuel incentives comes from the charges that are applied to gasoline. Because there's still a lot of petroleum gasoline being bought. There's only, 1.5 billion gallons of diesel left. So most of the money comes from gasoline consumers. And, a lot of people are stuck having to drive an older, less efficient vehicle many miles a day to get to work, to get to the store, to get to the doctor. They don't have an option. There's a risk of regressive effects. The per gallon impact from the LCFS is a function primarily of two things, of what the target is in that year and what the credit price is. So even if the credit price stays low, as the target goes up, the per gallon price impact goes up. So if you're just going to throw more target at it, okay, maybe you could solve the problem. You have to throw a whole lot more target at it. You have to start getting into the, 30 to 40, even perhaps even, above that range before you really start soaking up all of the possible renewable diesel and get to the point where people have to look for the more expensive things, have to start saying, okay, I'm going to pay for $120, $150 credits and get the medium heavy EVs. But that's where now the price impacts start to get to potentially worrying, potentially regressive levels. And if you have those targets come now, the vast majority of people are still driving a gasoline car. EVs are, 5%, 6%, I think, of the fleet in California, somewhere in there. If you wait, by 2030, EVs will be about 20 to 25% of the fleet. If you wait till 2035, they'll be about 50% of the fleet. And California has a lot of policies that are aimed at trying to get EVs into lower income communities, into lower income drivers. They have incentives that are sort of income indexed to make them, more beneficial. They have incentives for used vehicles. They have programs to support shared electric mobility, kind of like, community EV, Zipcar, or Lyft or Uber in lower income communities to give shared access to EVs to do mobility. So we have these programs that are working to make sure that lower income people are not the last ones stuck in gasoline cars when the gas price impacts get high, but they're going to take time. You need a lot more EVs in the fleet. You need to have, we found from previous research, almost all of the new cars in California are bought by people who are above the median income. If you're below the median income, you're buying a used car. There's practically no used EVs on the market right now. I've been trying to buy a used plug-in hybrid for the last 6 months, and it's really hard to find anything.
Have you tried Hertz?
Yeah, they're selling a whole lot of Teslas. I'm not 100% sure I want to get in there. I'm worried about Tesla's long-run ability to support their product, but they're probably
two.
Fine.
One for now and one for later.
Yes, exactly. Using all this lucrative money I get for doing environmental policy analysis, I am indeed rolling in the bank, as they say. You want the question that I think the regulators really need to ask right now is, we need to have enough ambition that we are on a trajectory to get to carbon neutrality in 2045 and to get to the 40% statutory target of greenhouse gas reductions that is already in place in California. We have to meet those targets. And the midterm target is not just because like there's a law and it's a useful milepost, but a ton of emissions reduced today does more to help the climate than a ton of emissions reduced next year or 5 years from now. So near-term targets matter. You don't want to say we're going to delay everything and then like flip the entire fleet all at once in the last year. But you can have too much ambition. And you don't want to just, throw so much target at it that you get to the really bad regressive price impacts while all the lower income people in California are still stuck in a gasoline car and still stuck being exposed to those price increases. You want to go and very carefully pick the right trajectory that delays the ambition as long as you can while you keep working on getting EVs into lower income communities so that by the time that the targets get high enough that they're really going to be problematic, the only people who are left exposed to them are either are high enough on the income spectrum that gasoline is not the thing that's going to make or break their household budget.
Yeah.
For lower income people, gasoline is a pretty big chunk of their weekly, monthly, whatever spend. For mid to higher income people, it's not, and it's a little easier to absorb some of these gas price impacts. There will also be a lot more options available to people who find themselves very strongly exposed to those. That'd be a problem. They have the opportunity to get into an EV that is cost competitive, right? The people who stay in gasoline cars are the ones who either want to, and it's their own sort of informed decision, or it's just the incentive isn't there, that they don't drive much, or they need they get unique value out of having the internal combustion engine.
Yeah,
So
very
all
interesting. I mean, it's such like a tight line to walk, I feel like.
It really is.
Really, stepping on the gas pedal as hard as you possibly can. And there's a lot of EJAC community and entities out there that really feel like that can be stepped on harder. But you have to ensure that the policy is in a place where it just simply straight up won't be repealed because so many people are paying out of pocket for it.
And it's really weird for me, having spent several years doing climate advocacy, where the message was almost always do more. Mm-hmm. Do more. Like, we need to be doing more. Now to be one of the few people going, hang on a second, like,
More could be
ambition
less,
for ambition's sake is not necessarily the best course of action. Like, this is not a familiar space for me to be saying, be less ambitious on a critical climate policy. But
that's a tough thing to convince people.
It really is.
Yeah.
So getting back to the LCFS and the current dynamic. So we have this dynamic where RD the economics term is it's setting the marginal cost of compliance in the LCFS. And that compliance has been set, in kind of the $60 to $80 credit price range. Nothing's going to change that as long as RD can keep coming in at the same credit price, and we don't see anything that seems likely to change that. The only way we see that you're going to get the credit price to go up is either jack the targets so high that you run into these regressive impacts, or restrict the ability of renewable diesel to be that, to be the marginal compliance fuel. There are multiple kind of structures you can use within the LCFS to do that, but given that we're in the rulemaking right now and we have to deploy it, at this point, halfway through the rulemaking, CARB can't just like pull a brand new idea, off a clean sheet of paper and jam it in. There's analysis they are required to do under multiple, like the Administrative Procedures Act and things like that. So they can really only, right now, their toolkit is limited to the things that they have previously analyzed. And the only thing they've analyzed is a cap. Now, they analyzed a cap. It was one of the things the Environmental Justice Committee asked for, and they basically wanted a cap at 2020 levels, which is very, very low. Way below where we are now. And CARB looked at it and said, well, if we go to a 2020 cap, all of a sudden we'd have to go from like the 2.5 billion gallons of diesel substitutes back down to like 1 billion. That's a really big problematic change, and we shouldn't do that. Okay, that's fine. You don't have to set a cap at the 2020 level, right? You can do a cap at a more reasonable level. So we put out a report in February where we started doing some modeling and digging into these dynamics a bit. And while the model that we have is not terribly sensitive and precise at understanding how, lipid-based fuel producers make feedstock decisions, so it's not perfect for it. We found that if you set the level at about 2020 values, where we're using about 2 billion gallons, that's likely to avoid some of the worst cost impacts. Right now, the what our model says is if CARB adopts its current proposal, even with a 7% or 9% step down, so doing this really big jump in 2025 to try to soak up these credits, even with that, you're going to have the auto acceleration mechanism trigger twice as soon as it's going to happen. that means you'll end up with a 39% target in 2030, and that's where at least me personally, starts to get uncomfortable about the regressive gas price impacts.
Starts getting a little steep at the tail end there.
It starts getting a little steep at the tail end, exactly. And so if you restrict the ability of renewables, basically not saying we need to get rid of it, but say we need to not continue to let it grow at the really fast rate it's grown at the last few years, to kind of put a ceiling on it, I think that's how you thread the needle. Now, you want to make sure that anybody who has invested tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in making renewable diesel does not feel like the rug has been yanked out from under them, right? You don't want to go and make people start distrusting policy incentives like the LCFS when they choose what to invest in.
Right.
So if the any sort of cap involves scaling back the amount of renewable diesel production, you want to do that slowly and gradually and make sure that the emergence of New Mexico and Washington and Canada, these other clean fuel standards, give enough market for those fuels to find a home. All the investments that have already been made, you want to make sure that they don't all of a sudden go south in a hurry, and everybody starts just ignoring CARB when it sets targets and says give us alternative fuels.
Right.
But you want to kind of cap the growth and not let the growth continue, because if you do that, even with the big step downs, you can get enough compliance credit for 2 or 3 years probably out of just more renewable diesel. That's what the market's likely to do, and you're not going to get the credit price coming up until you've gotten through that period, and absorbed it and sort of accepted all the consequences that come with it. On top of that, we are now well outside of the ILUC analysis they did in 2016. They used a model that was state of the art at the time, but it has since been found to have multiple problems that tend to underestimate ILUC impact. And the way you model ILUC is you create this model of the world, the International Agricultural Commodity System, and then you calibrate it to whatever historical data you have, and you say, okay, we're going to add a biofuel industry in North America of X size, and see how the global agricultural community satisfies that new demand. And that's how you kind of estimate what the ILUC impact is. Well, the analysis they did in 2016 assumed a 1 billion gallon a year lipid-based fuel industry, because it was done before renewable diesel was really a thing. So they thought it was only going to be biodiesel. It was a much smaller industry. Again, we're at 5 billion gallons a year right now. So we are now
with more
at
on
an
the way,
industry, many times the size of the analysis they did. We are not terribly confident that the values produced in that research are giving us accurate guidance for the industry of today. And CARB is very reluctant to say, okay, let's go back and update those.
Yeah, it's a big industry. It's a big lobby too, right? Hard to push back on.
It's expensive. It's a minimum 2 or 3 year project, probably over $1 million to develop a new ILUC model and to really answer that question in a better way.
Yeah.
We would have had to start 2 or 3 years ago. We didn't. So even if CARB said, you're right, let's revise those, we're not going to have a better ILUC answer that can get us that better, more precise, calibrated approach in the biofuel space for a few years. So if that's plan A, if that's the more sort of gentle, nuanced, responsive way to deal with this, you got to start thinking about what plan Bs are, and that's where a more blunt approach like a cap starts to make sense.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, totally. Well, ILUC is one of my favorite acronyms we've had on the show so far.
Yeah.
Indirectly
Always has to
change for those just tuning in here. Well, like you said, plenty of rabbit holes on any one of these topics. I think there might need to be a season 2 on this discussion coming up. I know that we're going to have some new regulatory language coming out of the ARB here pretty soon, all sorts of new developments going on in New Mexico and elsewhere. So lots to chew on. I would hope that maybe we can do this again in the future. Wrapping things up real quick, I think we want to do something a little bit new, which is fun. Just a lightning round here.
All right.
Lane is going to walk you through it. Here's the catches. It's got to be short, punchy. Just kind of first thing that comes to mind on these particular questions for you, and then we'll wrap things up from there. So,
all right,
Lane, go for it.
Bring it.
All right. So question number 1. What advice would you give yourself at the beginning of your career in transportation and low carbon fuel research?
The path to success is not a straight line. There's going to be wins and losses. The story of the bill that I introduced and lost the fight with oil ends up being a really interesting one, where we lost the first fight, but then some concepts got in. So yeah, you've got to stick with it, and it's not going to be easy or direct to get to success.
Now, number two, following on that, if you had a magic wand, what is one thing you would change about policymaking for low carbon fuels in the United States?
I mean, I think we needed to have investment into research and modeling in the 2010s. Because nobody was funding any of this stuff, there was no research, there were no grad students coming out doing this, and so now the community is tiny. Every LCFS, California, Oregon, Washington, they all have empty seats on their teams that they're having trouble filling because nobody's got the expertise.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would, like apart from make me the czar, let me, model these things and do that in sort of like the quantitatively optimal wonks way, and political considerations be damned. Let's say that's off the table. But then, we need to have investment in modeling and tools. We do not have enough, both just modeling tools and not enough human capital in the space to effectively address all the questions there are right now.
Maybe
and
we need to
industry
start...
experts too. Yeah, we need people with specific experience in different fuel sources, fuel types, and I feel like these agencies are kind of spreading themselves thin across a whole bunch of different verticals.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tough. Previously, the fuel space was petroleum.
Yeah.
And now the fuel space is petroleum, but it's also agriculture because of biofuels. It's utilities from electricity. It's advanced technology. It's climate policy. There's huge trade implications. Critical minerals are now getting into every projection on how quickly EVs can deploy. So now the fuel sector is the economy, like all of it. Everyone is now a fuel producer, and everyone has multiple ways to engage as fuel consumers. So yeah, the skill set it takes to do this, it's the models we make in a lot of cases, they're not always that methodologically complex, and some of them have got some really exotic math and optimization modeling, but a lot of it, the model that I used to do the reports that in the comment letter we submitted to CARB, it's just a big Excel spreadsheet with basic stats and a whole lot of algebra and a whole lot of us spending time going, where do I find this weirdo bit of data? To fill in, to have something better than my own guess there. It doesn't take, it's not rocket surgery. It can be simple, but you have to spend time in the space to understand where are all the weird analytical skeletons buried that you need to be aware of whenever you're interpreting someone else's model or someone else's data.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Elaine, number three.
Number three, coming right at you. What innovative technology in the clean transportation world are you most excited about?
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's lithium-ion batteries. They're really one of the only technologies in the space that has consistently overperformed its projections. Like the one of the graphs, and the one I sort of like really queued up to show. I can even throw it on screen real quick here. Oh wait, now the button's not working. So it's this one. So this is from a 2011 MIT technology review. And it's this graph in the top left, which is they reviewed all the estimates of lithium-ion battery cost, through 2020. And this is their best and worst case scenario. And you'll see that like their best case scenario was $225 a kilowatt hour batteries in 2020. Right? We were at like 200 in 2016 or so. So we were kind of down here in the caption by 2016. By 2020 we were down at what, like 150, 125, so we're kind of, down here. And this is MIT, so they are reasonably authoritative on matters relating to technology. They're not exactly known for being pessimistic about, their projections of future technology. So if MIT got it this wrong, I think it explains why so many of the policies in the transportation space are where they are. Back in, I was a grad student at ITS Davis back in 2010. And, the feeling was if we had things like the first gen Nissan Leaf, like maybe by the 2020s, we might be getting those kind of broadly deployed, sort of 100-mile EVs that people could use for local commuting. But, but that was it. That was sort of the goal. And as it turns out, we've got much better. They're equivalent range. They're cheaper. They're better. So, yeah, the fact that lithium-ion batteries managed to overperform and almost nothing else in this space has overperformed is to me one of the most optimism-inducing things we can possibly have.
And it's really impacting everything off-road as well. We're seeing LA just all over. So I'm very excited about it. All right, Lane, I think we got one more.
Yeah, very last one. And, considering food is fuel at the end of the day, if, Colin, anyone listening, all tens of them, were interested in coming to visit you in Davis, what would you recommend? Where would you recommend they go to eat in Davis?
That's a good one. So it's a bit of a cop out, but I actually might take them to Sacramento. Because there is a fantastic
we'll
restaurant scene in Sacramento. Like Davis is a college town, and it's got some good, college food spots. It's weirdly, the Mexican places in Davis are not that great, which is out of keeping with Northern California's usual tradition of fantastic Mexican food. But there's a lot of really great places in Sacramento, which is a hop, skip, and the jump across the causeway away. One of my favorites is a place called Mother. It's this vegetarian vegan restaurant, and I'm an omnivore. I definitely eat meat, but one of my favorite places to go in Midtown. A lot of other good restaurants. There's a place that does like sushi but with Mexican flavors, so kind of a fusion. A few really good other tons
Colin,
of stuff.
I live here in Sacramento, and you're teaching me some new things. I'm definitely gonna have to go look that up on Yelp later.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to share.
We're not allowed to ask that question before lunch anymore.
I know.
Yeah. In Davis, there's a good Indian place that I like too, but I couldn't call it like legendary. Not as good as the Indian place that was there when I was undergrad here 20 years ago, unfortunately. But yeah. Also, just we're in the produce capital of the world, so go to a farmer's market, get some fresh fruit. Summer, so we got beautiful peaches and nectarines, and if you haven't tried a canary melon, try a canary melon. You can now they're starting to come into some of the farmers markets. They're like what a honeydew is supposed to be. When they're ripe, they're sweet, they're crisp, they have none of that weird melon funkiness and the cloying sweetness to it. They're just like a honeydew leveled up into its final form.
Oh wow!
And I would
the final evolution.
Yeah. Find a canary melon.
Thrown under the bus. Not what I expected.
Hey, listen, it's a perfectly good melon. It has been there. It has been consistently adequate in prepackaged fruit salads for decades. It
just takes up the volume. That's all.
It is solidly okay. Yeah. But a canary melon is much better than okay, and I'd highly recommend that.
All right. That sounds gonna have to keep that one in the books there. Well, Colin, like I was saying, plenty of stuff to revisit on this. A lot of interesting things evolving in the near term here on these policies. Really appreciate you jumping on the charge cycle with us today. Again, everybody, Colin Murphy, he's the co-director of the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiative at UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies. Colin, thanks again. Really appreciate you being here, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, happy to be here. Anybody who's listening, feel free to sort of look me up. You can find my email address on the website. We also have a site, lowcarbonfuel.ucdavis.edu, that has a lot of our recent publications and resources. So I'm happy to be a help as all you move through this interesting time we have in the fuel space.
Sounds good, Colin. For everyone else, we will put the some extra details in the show notes for you. Until next time, though, thanks for listening to the Charge Cycle. Get out there and get plugged in.
Bye.
Thanks.